Hello. This is the reading of Chapter 8 of Life, Death, and In-Between by SaturdayNightFrights, and read by Poltergeist. This is a Danny Phantom and DCU crossover fic. And so, without further ado, please enjoy the fic. Chapter 8. Devastatingly Young. Acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It means understanding that something is what it is, and that there's got to be a way through it. Michael J. Fox. Dick waved Danny off with a smile that belied the unease he was feeling. The kid slowly wandered off, looking back at Dick, as if to silently ask permission. Or maybe he was just surprised that Dick wasn't going to keep the kid in the leash, despite previous attempts to run away. He sighed heavily through his nose, leaning against the librarian's counter. It wasn't as if the kid would make it far, even if he did try to flee. Dick listened to the steady drum of the librarian's fingers against the countertop, ignoring the stare currently burning holes into the back of his head. She cleared her throat, and Dick slowly turned to face her, a charming smile spreading across his face. "Babs!" She pointed at him accusingly with her pen, brown eyes staring him down with serious intent. "Don't you Babs me Richard John Grayson," she said, a small frown on her pretty face. Barbara swung her pen to point in the direction that Danny had walked off in. "What is that?" "Who? The kid?" "No, the jumping giant rabbit behind you." "Yes, the kid," Barbara said, exasperatedly. Dick groaned and rubbed at his face, sliding one hand into his hair to tug at the strands, feeling more stressed about the situation by the second. He had not considered the immediate repercussions of his mass surveillance system, namely the fact that Barbara, Oracle, would have seen the entire interaction from the night before, seen Danny and his exceedingly obvious resemblance to Damien. Hadn't considered that he'd need to explain himself, at least, if he wanted Barbara to try to hide said footage from Bruce, which he did. Then Barbara had started blowing up his phone, and reality slammed back into him. "I don't know." Barbara frowned up at him, brown eyes flicking through her computer monitors, likely tracking Danny's movements as they spoke. "You said it wasn't another clone situation," she said slowly, referring to their sporadic texts throughout the day. "It's not," Dick said. "At least, I'm mostly sure it's not, but I don't know exactly what's going on." He thought about Danny's skittishness, his attempts to escape, not fight, his wounds. "So, you just happened upon the one kid in the whole world who's Damien's doppelganger but isn't a clone," she said sardonically, giving Dick a completely unimpressed, deadpan look over the rim of her glasses. He shrugged. "Pretty much. You can see why I find that hard to believe." "Believe what you want. It's the truth," he sighed, glancing at the place he'd last seen Danny. Barbara took a deep breath and turned towards her computer screens, typing away at something. Her eyes flicked over to him, watching as she considered her next words. "Well, you know you'll have to patrol again tonight." She fixed her gaze on him. "Your 4-day absence raised some questions, you know." He groaned, pulling at his hair. "Oh, I can imagine." She paused, the ambient sound of the library filling the silence between them. "If you're sure it's not another clone situation, why haven't you gone to Bruce yet?" He went still at her question. Why hadn't he gone to Bruce? Dick trusted his dad implicitly on a lot of things. He also knew the man incredibly well. Knew that Bruce was prone to judgments and calls that Dick wouldn't agree with. He was overly cautious at the best of times, and overly inquisitive. Danny was ostensibly not a threat. Unfortunately, Dick could not be certain that Bruce would immediately see the boy in the same light that Dick had come to. Not that Dick could blame his father. It was just that, when he thought of Danny, the skittish, untrusting teen who was so obviously terrified of something, who was scared and untrusting and injured and alone. Danny didn't have anyone else he could run to if meeting Bruce went badly. He only had Dick. Would the boy even trust Dick after introducing him to fucking Batman? He couldn't do it. Couldn't bring himself to unleash the brunt of Batman's gaze and unyielding questions upon the kid. Not when he just started to place some trust in Dick. Not when he was still so fragile and injured. Dick cleared his throat. "There's just some things I want to take care of first," he said. Dick's expression grew dark as he thought about Danny's wounds, about the kid's obvious anxiety and distrust. and the pain he had been hiding. What happens to a person, to a child, that they have to hide the fact they're injured to adults? Hide their wounds until they're festering and rotting in their flesh. He could not turn the image from the night before from his mind, the gruesome scene of his rancid wounds and the story they whispered. Barbara reached a hand across the counter, easing his hand out of the fist he had unknowingly made. She squeezed his hand. Dick looked down at where they were clasped together. "That bad?" she whispered. "That bad." "Hey," she said softly. "Whatever's going on, you don't have to pick it apart on your own, Boy Wonder. God bless Barbara Gordon." He squeezed her hand back and winked, giving Babs a soft smile that belonged only to her. She suddenly sat up straight, quickly pulling her hands from his, brown eyes pinned on something just behind him. Dick turned slightly to see Danny, the boy quickly making his way up to the pair. He came close to Dick's side, ice-cold fingers wrapping around Dick's wrist with a vice-like grip. "Can we leave?" he asked. Barbara gave Danny a quick smile. "You didn't find any books you're interested in?" "No," he said flatly, looking back up at Dick. "Can we leave now?" he asked again. "Please?" Dick arched an eyebrow, exchanging a confused look with Barbara. "So soon?" He hid a flinch as Danny's grip on his wrist tightened into a hold that reminded him uncomfortably of the few times he'd been grabbed by a Kryptonian. "Please," Danny repeated. Dick took note of the tightness of Danny's shoulders, the tense air about the kid, and realized that he was afraid. In the small amount of time he'd been out of Dick's sight, something had scared Danny. Yeah, all right," Dick said, waving goodbye to Barbara as the two left the library, her gaze demanding answers from him that he'd have to give later. Danny was silent on the way back to the apartment, pale blue eyes periodically flickering to look to the side, to look behind him, as if the kid was expecting to find someone following him. In hindsight, Danny may have overreacted a little bit. The more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that he'd happened upon some poor pharmacist on his break. Some random, unfortunate pharmacist who did not deserve the poltergeist activity of books flying off the shelves at him as Danny made a beeline back to Dick. At least he hadn't hit the guy. Probably. Still, the white lab coat had Danny seeing and feeling things that were not there, hearing disembodied screams, phantom knives dragging across his skin. He'd gone to the one source of comfort he'd had in recent memory. Thankfully, Dick didn't ask any questions or pry into Danny's sudden insistence on leaving, even though Danny had interrupted his flirt session with the pretty librarian. He danced around the subject before leaving that night, shifting on his feet as he lingered by the front door. Dick didn't seem to want to leave Danny alone that night, and it was only after Dan repeatedly insisted that he was fine did the man leave. As much as Danny really wished that Dick had stayed, he also knew that, well, the man was a superhero. Superheroes had to do their superhero thing. Danny would know. So, with a soft rustling of his hair, Dick had left Danny to his own devices. He had hoped to calm down, get some rest. Dick was insistent on Danny resting, so Danny had promised to get some much-needed sleep, which was a lie that Dick thankfully ignored, and to absolutely, under no circumstances, leave the apartment, which was the truth. Unsurprisingly, he couldn't sleep. Instead, Danny had laid in the dark room, thoughts racing around his mind. This was how he'd come to the conclusion that he may have, sort of, overreacted in the library. He'd mulled over the memory of seeing the man in between the library stacks, of the white coat, the immediate fear and rush to get away. Over and over, he turned the memory in his mind. Likely, the man was just a guy in white, not a guy in white. If Danny focused, he could hear Jazz's voice in his head, droning on about the effects of trauma, the long-term negative effects of sleep deprivation. Danny had decided to ignore imaginary Jazz, turning over in bed to glare at the alarm clock, cheerfully blinking the numbers 4 at him. 4 in the morning. It would still be some time before Dick returned, and the longer still until Danny could leave the room without arousing too much concern and suspicion. He frowned, rolling onto his back to stare up at the ceiling. Sleep was not a necessity the way it used to be. Not that it ever really had been. Danny could go days without sleeping even before his accident. Often did, much to Jazz's chagrin. He didn't need to sleep, or at least didn't believe that he did. So why did he feel so exhausted all the time? For a half-dead god king, he really should be above such things, even if the wounds on his chest said otherwise. Actually, he was pretty certain that Jazz and Sam had once lectured him on the importance of sleep in relation to healthy and healing. Not that he had paid attention to them, and he certainly wasn't inclined to apply their theory now, although he was starting to feel bad about the amount of gray hair he was undoubtedly adding to Dick. Maybe he should try to get some actual rest. However, tonight, like all other nights, sleep was evading Danny, offering him no respite from his thoughts. Horrid memories lurked in the corners, and he was resolutely not going to go to memory lane and send himself spiraling in Dick's absence. Nope, not Danny, no way. Instead, he would close his eyes and immediately sit straight up in bed as a muffled thud came from the living room. Danny went still, ears strained to pick up any other noise. He had almost dismissed it when he heard shuffling from beyond his door, as if someone was walking around the apartment. He frowned and slowly got out of bed, silently padding over to the door to open it a crack. Danny peered out into the darkness. Maybe Dick was home? It wasn't out of the question, but Danny wanted to make sure. His eyes scanned the room, latching onto a form by a kitchen island. The shadow of a man, taller and broader than Dick. His back turned to Danny as he fumbled with something on the island counter. Danny felt like ice had been poured down his back. His eyes flickered to the bedside table, looking for a weapon to defend himself against this intruder. Weakened as he was, Danny could still put up a fight. A couple of pens caught his attention. Danny grabbed them and slowly made his way into the living area, moving as to not make a sound and alert the intruder to his presence prematurely. He gripped a pen in his hand. He aimed and threw it. The pen was a blur as it passed by the man's head, slamming into the wood of the cabinets with a sound like a gun going off. The man flinched, a loud expletive escaping him as he quickly whirled to face Danny. In the dim light provided by the street lamps outside, Danny could make out a helmet that covered the man's entire head. No face to be seen, but Danny could feel the look of incredulity the man gave him. What the fuck, demon brat? Hello. I'd just like to say thank you for listening to the end of the video. I really do appreciate it. I think I'm coming down with something. I had to pause the recording a few times to clear my throat. I do hope you couldn't tell. I mean, that's what travel will do to you, but also I filmed this right after last chapter, so that could be a reason. Anyways, if you enjoyed the podfic, you can leave me a like, maybe subscribe. Also, if you have a request or a fic you'd like me to read, please leave a comment to let me know. Anyways, I do hope you enjoyed. Until next time, this is Poltergeist, signing off.